Thank you very much, Amit, and good morning, everyone. It's so lovely to see you in this beautiful city of Delft and also with such mild weather. I think the last time I came here, I almost lost my hat. And it was fascinating because I was like, oh my God, it better not fall into the canal. I'll jump in for it because I love my hat. It's such an honor to be here, and I will just share, and I want to give a disclaimer because the story I'm going to share, or at least the journey I'm going to share, is only a part of the picture. But I'm also very fortunate to have been either in those rooms, in spaces, in programs and projects, and now heading a multilateral institution with a lens of water. The picture I'm sharing on the screen is a river somewhere, I think most likely in Brazil, but I also grew up in a small town in Zambia, about 100 meters for a river that looked like that. So I was very fortunate because I swam and hang out with my twin sister, not even imagining that the crocodiles would eat us. I was born in northern Zambia. Now, what we do know for sure, we are in the Goldilocks zone because we're neither too hot, we're neither too cold, because we're very lucky. And we're just the one and only blue planet. And sometimes I think we take that for granted. And we think maybe there's another planet out there. So just sharing very quickly, I want to highlight the percentage of water on the planet, which you all know. Yeah, 71 and data, yada, 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 yada. But this is also almost the same percentage of water in our bodies. But we're even more sophisticated in essence that we mirror the very planet that we live in, the biome, the gut biome, and the very living essence of our survival is pretty much connected to Mother Earth. Okay, let's see if this moves. I think I'll just go to the traditional way. So I'll share very quickly a little bit about my journey. So when I started as a wetland ecologist, I was in university at University of Zambia when I was doing sampling of water in the Kafue Flats. By the way, I used to go to the same wetland system on holiday with my parents. I never in the wildest of dreams imagined that I would work there. And neither did I even imagine that I would end up doing my PhD there. So eventually I ended up doing my PhD in this very ecosystem in the Kafue Flats, which is beautiful, but also very much affected by invasive species. Why freshwater ecosystems? Because they make 1% of the planetary dynamic. They're less salt concentration and their ponds, rivers, etc. We know them from wherever you're coming from. I understand there's about 41 countries represented in this module. So it's exciting. So you all come from a source of water somewhere that is fresh. And why do they matter? Because they're diverse in their very being. Lentic systems, lakes, wetlands, ponds, lotic systems, flowing, streams, creeks, and the ones that we always forget, a little out of sight, but very present, groundwater. And in some instances, we begin to understand why this complexity. The complexity is because the decline of freshwater species is 2 to 3 times faster than the terrestrial. And WWF, the Living Planet Index report, has shown that. And we have done extensive work in the last 54 years of this convention that I had, that well over 35% now, in fact, if you look up our Global Wetland Outlook, and I'll share a little bit later, over 35% of wetlands have been lost. In fact, wetlands are disappearing 3 times faster than forest ecosystems. And freshwater ecosystems have specific vulnerabilities. And so some of the examples I will share in relation to habitat fragmentation that we've experienced in many parts of the world. But I'll also talk about something that is extremely serious, including here in the Netherlands and here in Europe, and pretty much in every corner of the planet, the pollution aspect and how it manifests in water. But let's begin by the one thing that we're all very dependent on, the hydrological cycle. I'm sure you've all seen this diagram before. You know, the hydrological cycle starts over here and then it does this, and, you know, a beautiful diagram, wonderful schematic. But people forget that many indigenous and traditional peoples know about the hydrological cycle, have talked about the hydrological cycle. And the language they've used is sky rivers. That there are sky rivers in the Amazon, in parts of Africa, in parts of different places in the world. Now, what's even more fascinating is that last October, there was a fantastic report that was released, led by Henk Ovink, who some of you may know, who's the executive director of the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, working very closely with Johan Rockström and many other scientists, and they did something absolutely spectacular. Now, thanks to European Space Agency, Japanese, etc., all the different space agencies, Johan, with his team, the climatic team at Planck's Institute, decided to really look to the story of the sky rivers. And with satellite imagery, what they mapped was exactly what either an Aborigine or a Quechua or somebody has visualized in their deep memory because it's innate. And there are the sky rivers. That is the picture of our hydrological cycle, where nature and water knows no boundary. And it's a beautiful, it's actually an animated hydrological cycle. So if you go to the report, the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, you're going to see this. But they also amplified something to really demonstrate what's important: the green and the blue water. So the water on land, surface, what we see on forests, the evapotranspiration, also connected to the groundwater, and then the blue, that is also connected to the oceanic system and all of that. How do these interact together to really make sure that our planet is as comfortable as can be, the way we should know it? Now, I'm going to give you a very quick example. This is our largest Ramsar site in the world. It's 12 million hectares. It's called Rio Negro in Brazil. Now, thanks to Copernicus, and we just signed an agreement with the European Space Agency, you can see the dramatic difference. And next week, the world meets in Belém to discuss climate. And in Brazil, there has been dramatic shifts. Really, you can just see the difference in a year. And the Amazon is a big river. But you begin to see the implications of climate and the shifts in that hydrological cycle. So going back a little bit in history, perhaps it's important to also note, and I'm glad that Rohan is here. We are such curious creatures, humans. The one thing that we've done in most, if not all of our civilizations, is how do we harness water? How do we get it to us? How do we store it? And how do we make sure that it's really where it's supposed to be? And so the Romans did what they did, and we see a lot of these structures across Europe. I've been through some places in France. I worked in Rome, Italy, and I mean, these are huge, massive investments, and must have been a lot of work. Aqueducts, moving of water, making sure that movement of water. This is just one of very many examples. The Qanat, which we see in Iran and other places in what was, part of Persia. Fascinating. We've always tried to figure out how to get water to ourselves. But now I'm going to do a quick deep dive in the world of water and its plurality and why it matters for you and I. For a lot of people in the world, when you talk about water, this is what comes to mind. And in fact, for many children, unfortunately, if you're in the city, this is what comes to mind. Is it flowing? Is it not flowing? Unfortunately, for many other children from my part of the world, this is not the story. They don't even have the tap. So they're trying to figure out where's actually the water coming from. Water comes from many sources. I just came from Switzerland. I live in the Alps. I look at the mountains every day. But you also saw what happened in May this year in Blatten when a glacier just wiped out a whole village. The changes and dynamics in the cryosphere. We also use water for hydroelectricity. So really examples of where Nature is providing, we're using. This is the hydrological dam in Zambia and Zimbabwe. And I've been to the Kariba many times. It is the world's largest man-made lake. In the last 3 years, it has had less than 10% capacity to generate electricity. And that's meant my country, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, I don't know so much about Zimbabwe, but in Zambia, we have about 3 hours of electricity a day. So think about hospitals, think about work, think about so you begin to see this interrelationship and interlocutor and interconnectivity of water and development, water and living, water and health, water and nature. And in many places where we're anticipating and hoping they're free-flowing rivers, and we're hoping they can stay that way, in some places they're not. So there's some beautiful places where you see the free-flowing rivers. Now, this is the Haut-Savoie in France. Now, the story that you may not be familiar with, how many have been to the Haut-Savoie? Okay, parfait. Now, in Evian-les-Bains, which is across from Lausanne in Switzerland, this is a beautiful mountain. And in here, just below here and at the back of Evian-les-Bains, is a beautiful wetland, a pit system called the Marais du Vin. Now, the Marais du Vin gives you something that I think 3/4 of you have used. Can anybody guess?
Water bottle?
Correct. So, Evian bottles water from the Haut-Savoie, from the Marais du Vin, 7 million bottles a day. And I've been to the factory. Directly from the aquifer, directly from nature's gift, from groundwater. So it looks beautiful, but what you do not realize, thank you, is that the Haut-Savoie has been a source of this incredibly and fascinating mineralized water. Because when it was discovered 200 years ago, it actually clears kidney stones because of the mineralization of the water through the mountains and ancient glaciers and systems. And then, of course, some other beautiful places. This is in Canada. And ponds, and I'll talk a little bit about this later. I was in Bali last year in July, and I was fascinated to see the cascading terraces of Bali. Now, what people do not also realize is that the wetlands of Bali, the rice paddies, are the least methane producing wetland systems. And the reason being the Balinese, when each of these terraces start to fill up with water, they introduce fish, they introduce eels, the snails come in. So the biodiversity is also managing the balance of space in a very fascinating. These terraces are from the 11th century. And they get passed on from one family to the next. For the Balinese, water is sacred. And then there's Mexico. If you've watched Black Panther, Wakanda, the second one, you've seen the Chinote, the guy who goes underground. The Chinotes of Yucatan are also our wetland systems under Ramsar. Beautiful, fascinating, and complex systems. And what these are is this is where ocean meets land in a very fascinating way. And one of the complexities of Mexico, and I'll give a very interesting story about Mexico, is how the use of water sous terre, below the earth, is also a very complex conversation in this very seemingly diverse space. Let's come to Switzerland. A couple of years ago, I was doing some filming in Neuchâtel, and I heard through the rumors, I heard that there's been a discovery. Discovery? What do you mean? And then a scientist told me, well, actually the caste system of Neuchâtel, Switzerland in the Ice Age was connected to the sea. Oh, okay. In my mind, I'm thinking, Ice Age, my children have watched this movie. Cool. But what does that mean? Now, this karst system is fascinating. The filtration of water as it gets into Lake Neuchâtel, the largest inland water in Switzerland, is determined by a crustacean which looks like a shrimp. And it was discovered by this wonderful man. It's called the Ghiella monardi. Now, this crustacean is well over 20 million years old and still exists in that karst system. Now, what they're beginning to realize is that this Ghiella monardi, named after this guy and his other colleague who discovered it a few years ago, it gives you an indicator of the shifts in temperature and the quality of water that goes into Lake Neuchâtel before it is distributed to the cities and the villages around. So you see how nature is interacting, even it's an ancient way, through a karst system to determine the water supply of a town. Now, in many of these places, there are challenges, and these challenges are immense. Invasive species. When I worked in Zambia, this is from 1995, I was a biologist on the Kafue River. And this is one of the hydroelectricity supply dams. And the green that you see there is the famous water hyacinth. And this plant is perverse. And it doesn't joke. It literally bend. Those are metal bars. What you see here, these are massive metal bars which were almost 1/2 meter wide. They were bent by the pressure of the plant. And what you see with all of this is that the complexity of pollution, livelihoods, survival, just with an invasive. And then in Lake Victoria, in comes this other big guy called the Nile perch. This dude was introduced because of angling. And he came in with his brothers and sisters and cousin and I don't know who and ate all the little fish. All. So you begin to see how imbalance happens in a freshwater ecosystem, all because of invasive, but it's a very yummy fish, that one. Then there's the regulation aspect. I went to China many years ago and I did understand what they meant. And I was in Wuhan in about 2005, 2006, and we're doing some work on the Yangtze River. And I was extremely shocked when I learned about the plans to do the Three Gorges Dam. That was in 2006. Many years later, we read in the news, they have flooded 3 cities and they've done the world's largest hydroelectricity dam. So we begin to see how regulation to deal with needs for development also shift and change the dynamics of water. Chemical pollution. And I was talking about how this is showing up here in Europe. Not so long ago, about 4 or 5 months ago, if you Google it, there were 2 or 3 towns in France where they were told, do not, and we repeat, do not touch the tap water. And literally most of their supermarkets ran out of fresh water, bottled water. Why? Because of PEPFARs, forever chemicals. They found that the amount in the rivers was so high that even the cleaning was not happening very well, and it was all over the news. But what France also did very well is that, you know what, we love cooking with those pans with teffel. Apparently teffel is quite bad because the layering of the pots is what has a lot of the forever chemicals and many other chemicals, including cleaning utensils. So you begin to realize that how we are living and interacting with freshwater spaces in these geographies of what I call, geographies of space is fascinating, but also very interconnected. And I will share how. We talk about plastics. Plastic pollution is everywhere. This August, unfortunately, the plastic negotiation treaty failed in Geneva. And part of the reason is because plastic as a product is a fossil product, and the fossil industry is extremely powerful. Now, how do plastics show up? In many places. I lived in Kenya for 18 years. When I went into places like Kibera or in other places where I worked, people are supplied with water in plastic sachets. So you begin to think where the plastic sachet is going to go if they're not collected ideally in the river, in a lake, somewhere. But a lot of this plastic, you're wearing it. Yeah, You heard me right. You're wearing it in the form of polyester. Now, what has happened is that because of trade, another aspect, a lot of trading from Global North, the Netherlands included, and the UK, and many other places, the sale of secondhand clothes to the Global South. And sometimes they're not even sold, they're just dumped. They just say, you're going to take them. So you begin to see this complexity and injustice. And what shows up is this picture from Ghana. So a lot of the clothes, when they arrive in the market in Makola and many others, the quality of the clothes are so bad that the traders say, just dump them somewhere. And unfortunately, the dumping is so perverse, you can actually see it from space. The same in Chile. The same in parts of Argentina. Secondhand clothes. And now the polyester, as it begins to disintegrate, disintegrates into what are microplastics, ending up in the sea, into the river, which also has to do some supply to the city or to a locality. Then in comes climate change. Your beautiful country, Kazakhstan. I went to Uzbekistan last year, and I was extremely fascinated because when it's in the Southern Arrow, I was extremely intrigued. What I've seen on the cover of a National Geographic about the change of the Arrow Sea is incredible. But when you experience it first time, it is a shock to your system. So we drove with my colleagues. We left Samarkand, and we were going to see one of the Ramsar sites. And I was extremely exhausted. So I was napping. And then when I woke up, the car wasn't moving. I was like, what's going on? And when I looked in front of us was this white storm. So the guy, the driver, was like, we can't move. We have to wait for this to pass. A massive white storm, a salt storm. So when the soil is repletion of water and it dries, the surface has salt. And when the winds come, they lift the salt. And it was incredible because somehow it even came through the filters of the car and I could taste it. I'm like, wow. Then I asked the gentleman, because he's a focal point for our convention, what happens for people who live around here? He says, oh, madam, there's big discussions here in the region because of health reasons. Now, colleagues, I need to explain to you places like Utah and other parts of North America, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and many places when rivers, lakes dry, and if you have used them for irrigation, what remains below the sediment is chemicalized soil. And when it blows, that particulate matter is so dangerous that they are in places where they tell people stay inside. Because when it enters your lungs, it's almost like a nuclear bomb going off. People get sick and die because of these dust, sand, salt storms that are literally changing the way people exist. So you begin to see this complexity of health, wetlands, water. Fascinating. Now, for many of you, if you were in Europe, or if you were not, at least you saw this. While we were occupied with COVID, something else was happening here in Europe. It was a massive drought. And in France, on the Loire, the river just, houses were receiving tankers. I don't know are there any people from Kenya? The water supply, the truck that supplies water, truck that supplies water was all over on the streets of towns in the Loire. It was the first time people had seen that, but the river had no water. And now, what even confused people more was something manifest in Europe. And here in Europe, the carved stones showed up to say, and with messages that literally read, like on the Elbe River in Germany, that says, if you see the water below here, know that you're in trouble. That's what it said. It's carved there from the Moyen Age, from the Middle Ages. So that means that our ancestors knew that if the water levels go below this, know that you're in trouble. Now, in Lombardy, in Italy, next door, I don't know how many of you have been to Lombardy, Milan, Palma, this region. This is the breadbasket for much of Europe. Over 60% of the GDP of Lombardy. Parma cheese, Parmigiano, the salami, name it. And we have at least 6 Ramsar sites in this region. This is the Po River. The Po River starts all the way from the mountains, comes down, and then it flows into the Adriatic Sea. And the business of Parma, the business of Milano, the business of all of these spaces are dependent on water. And not just any water, clean water. So you begin to see that drought of 2021, 30% of the agriculture production literally just slumped, if not more. Actually, there were some underestimates there. So you begin to see, and then the saltwater intrusion into the Po River. So many of these complexities. Now, I'm going to share that all these places I've shown you, most of them are connected to our sites, what are called Ramsar sites. Now these, dear friends, all these blue dots are Ramsar sites, wetlands of international importance, designated by your countries, where you're from. We have 173 member states, dotted all over the world. And I've visited a few of them, and they're stunning, and they're important. And because of the location and complexity of all these sites, what we have done is we do what is called a global wetland outlook. Now, the one in July of this year, this outlook did something slightly different, because I challenged my team, my scientific team. I said, I need to be able to go to a minister of finance and say, sir, if this canal in Delft goes dry, what is the cost of losing the water in this canal for the city of Delft and much more? Just imagine it. What does it cost? How can I convince somebody in the parliament of the Netherlands? Because spaces are disappearing in the world. What is the cost of wetland loss? We're not just losing the visibility of the water, we're losing much more. We're losing the ecosystem services that are provided by having these spaces. So we did this report, which was very well taken. Many multilateral development banks are now thinking about giving us some assessments on natural capital and really discussing the power and value of water. Now, let me start with some case studies. I worked in Naivasha. In 2001, when I started my PhD in London, I'd already been working on some of the lake systems in the Rift Valley in East Africa. So when I finished my PhD in 2005 in the UK, I started to work on Lake Naivasha. Lake Naivasha is stunning. Now, if you've ever been to Lake Naivasha and the subsequent other Rift Valley lakes, particularly Bogoria, is flamingos. Now, this is an older picture from Lake Naivasha because there are no longer flamingos there because the groundwater shifted so much because of the tectonic dynamics that it is no longer saline, it is more fresh. So the flamingos have to go somewhere where they can actually find salty water for their algae. And I traveled to Austria about a year ago, and I was fascinated when I was in Austria because I went to this Schloss in Machegg, and this castle, on top of the castle were these beautiful nests. And they just informed me, oh, actually, the storks have just left. Okay, they're getting tracked. Okay. A few months down the line, I was in Kenya, and the storks had just arrived in Kenya, in Lake Naivasha. So you begin to see the element of connectivity. And there's a beautiful map there just showing which birds are migrating and where they're going. Now, what you know or may not know about Lake Naivasha, even though it's a Ramsar site, it is also the source of roses, and most of which are owned by Dutch companies and British companies. They grow at least 95% of the roses for the world. And they're stunning, and they're beautiful, and a lot of complex human rights issues because of labor. There's been a lot of discussion on the pollutants that go into the water. There's been a lot of discussion in terms of the actual long hours that women work. and sometimes without rest, and really all these complexities for the production of that beautiful flower. But even more complex was a conversation when I worked in WWF that we had with the flower farmers. How much water are you using to actually grow one rose? And there was a shift. By 2010, there was a shift in conversation because they suddenly introduced hydroponics so that there could be conservation of water, so that there's just a drop going to each plant that is growing. So you begin to see also the innovation and technologies, but still remains a very complex case. Let me take you to Mexico. When I got to Mexico, in the square of Mexico City is a massive, big, I've never seen that big flag in my life before. And it blows, massive big flag, but on the flag is a picture. So I was extremely curious. So I asked my colleague from Foreign Affairs, I said, sir, what is the story with your flag? Because I'm very intrigued and fascinated by flags. And he said to me, what you see there is the story of the Mexicana, the Aztecs, who you popularly know as the Aztecs. Now, the Mexicana had a folklore story, and they were told for thousands of years that keep walking, keep moving. And I don't know if they came from Canada or they were coming from next door in the US. It's become complicated these days. So as they were moving, they were told that when you see an eagle and a snake, that is the place where you're going to settle. And they moved and they walked, and I don't know how many years they moved and walked. And therein they found the eagle and the snake in a beautiful wetland called Texcoco. And what you see there is the agave, which of course they make tequila with, and the water, and the leaves. And I met the young Mexicana, the indigenous young people, in 2023 of March. And I sat with these young people and the community, and I said, what happened here? Because Texcoco is a Ramsar site. But not only is it a Ramsar site, it was contentiously fought for by the indigenous Mexicana. And Mexicana is why Mexico has its name as Mexico, because of the Mexicana people. So I arrive in Texcoco. And I'm fascinated because I asked for some pictures and they share with me some drawn pictures. And everywhere there are these runway-like things, but they're flooded. And I'm like, wow, okay, this is really fascinating. What's going on here? Now, the Mexicana went to the president, the previous president of Mexico, and said, look at the flag of Mexico. Our peoples fought and said, this is where we shall settle, which was the Aztec location. And this is our source of water, and this is the source of water for Mexico City. And you want to build an airport on Texcoco? You cannot. Because even if you do not see the water sometimes, it does come because it's there. You just may not see it all the time. And the birds migrate through Texcoco. And because of this, Texcoco was designated as a wetland of international importance. This is part of the flyway frontier from north of Alaska all the way to the top, to the tip, all the way to Argentina, up to Chile, going further on to Falkland Islands. This is where the birds migrate right through. Now, here's what's fascinating with Texcoco. The water that you see here, when we drove through here, it was stinking. And I was like, okay, something is not right here. What's going on? The sewage of Mexico City, 24 million people, 70% of that sewage flows into Texcoco. So the wetland does what it can do. It filters. And then it filters and then does it, but most of the time it's stressed. At the end of Texcoco is a pipe, a massive pipeline that goes to Hidalgo. It gets to Hidalgo, the city of Hidalgo, and they do what they do. They grow something we always see, and which we always like to eat. Tortilla, guacamole. But what we do not realize is that because of the pollutants in the water, most of Hidalgo has had cholera. Because the wetland is so stressed, it cannot deliver the quality, the service that it provides. So the tail end of one area is receiving water that is unclean, but they need to grow some food and agriculture. And because corn and avocados and other many crops, chili, etc., grow in the Hidalgo region, and these are water-thirsty crops. So with all of this, I want to take you to the multilateral space, because I heard a multilateral entity. What is a multilateral space? Government comes together, they sign up on a treaty, and they sit together and they have a conversation to be able to align, and with consensus, your governments have to agree on many issues, and with water in particular. So when we had COP14 in Geneva, the Geneva COP14, which was the Wuhan Geneva COP in 2022, we also agreed with the Convention on Biological Diversity, because a lot of these spaces in the world are extremely biologically diverse. And so we agreed to have a joint work plan, to amplify our joint work plan, which is now in its 6th iteration. So what are we doing with this joint work plan? With this joint work plan, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which you should be familiar with, is a biodiversity framework that also talks about where does this biodiversity exist? What is the extent of water? What is the extent of wetlands? So we have to intersect biodiversity with water because it matters. Now, in 2023, I was in New York. In March of 2023, I went to speak at the UN, and the second UN Water Conference took place after 46 years. Imagine that, 46 years. That's when we had the second UN Water Conference. That's the UN building there, and that is me speaking. And when I spoke at that event, I said something. In fact, I gave a poem from Somalia by Wasan Shire, and I summarized this poem, because Wasan Shire did a beautiful poem during COVID, which I think also relates to the water world. She said, when I touched the World Atlas with my fingers and asked, where does it hurt? It said, everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. And the crisis of water is everywhere. And how we deal with water is so intersectional and interrelated, and in many ways complex. And I will speak to that complexity very quickly. What happened with this meeting in New York? 700 commitments came out. Does anyone remember one? If you're familiar with the outcomes of the second UN Water Conference, 700 commitments. 700. So how does your country, how does Kenya, how does Kazakhstan, how does the Netherlands, how do countries actually implement these outcomes? And this is where it becomes a little complex and very difficult, and worse for mostly developing countries, because developing countries are dealing with all of these complex development agendas. They're like, okay, so what should we prioritize now? Should we prioritize electricity generation? Shall we prioritize, I see a hand. Correct. So, the water conversation, and I'll talk a little bit about it. The water conversation is anchored so water comes through all of the 17 development SDGs. Now, the water conversation, when these outcomes came through, there was a conversation to say, okay, hang on. So 700 outcomes, what does that mean? Now, what some countries did, they did something very interesting and very quickly. They said, okay, we're going to actually do something and figure out how we support many different countries. During the Biden presidency, there was an agreement of doing that 49 billion investment in climate resilient and sanitation infrastructure in different parts of the world. Japan also agreed that they will do something and contribute to some social issues in Asia Pacific, and also looking at different aspects and quality infrastructure. Vietnam made an investment pledge as well to look at river basin management. They are part of the Mekong River Basin. And also looking at how do we invest in water up to 2030 and beyond. And then Switzerland also made some commitments, because they also host of UNECE and the UN Water Convention, and many more and many more and many more. The government of Mozambique, the African Union. In fact, I was in Cape Town in August, where there was a conversation on the margins of the G20. South Africa is now the G20 presidency. So that we're talking about Africa water investments. What do we invest? By 2030, the EU, European Union, has pledged to support over 70 million individuals in all different manner of ways, etc., around water investments, etc. And you know that the EU also released earlier this year, which we as a convention contributed to, the water resilience strategy, which is obviously very important, not just for the EU region, but also beyond the EU. Private sector entities, Danone, also started to make investments in a lot of catchment area, looking at water stress and water access. Xylem, you may be familiar with this company, Water Benchmarking Alliance, Starbucks, Ecolab Gap, Reckitt and DuPont. Private sector entities started to think differently about water. But it's also very interesting, how do they actually do their investments around water? And I'll be very quick. Now, for us in the convention, in order to hold some of these organizations, countries, and others accountable, we have the guiding document or the guiding space, which is the 5th strategic plan. And this strategic plan has got these goals. We need to address and reverse wetland loss and degradation. We need to achieve wise use. We need to make sure we conserve and manage wetlands of international importance but we also need to enhance the convention because most of the water is coming from these wetland systems. And that's why partnerships matter. So we work not just with these organizations, but many others. So we are, as a convention, co-custodians on 6.61, together with UNEP, which looks at water extent. That is an indicator on water extent. What does it mean actually for sustainable development? The UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. I wish I had more time to talk about that because I've been involved in this work from its very inception. We work very closely with other UN entities, CBD. I talked a little bit about that. So when is the 3rd UN Water Conference? Anybody know? Yes? Sorry? It is next December, but where? By who? Who are the 2 co-custodian countries? Voila. Oh, I'm so glad. I'm speaking to the converted. So UAE and Senegal, and I've met both ministers of water because we, as a Convention on Wetlands, even though we are not part of the United Nations system, we are contributing substantively. So that map I showed you of all the Ramsar sites and the governance issues, and Arne over there, Professor Arne has been involved in one of our programs in the Caribbean to look at the governance of wetland system. And so some of that data is feeding into these conversations for the 3rd UN Water Conference. So in closing, what I want to say is that we are so intricately and universally connected to water. And wetlands are really the center of hydrological cycle and planetary health. There's a lot of conversation, there's a lot of reflections and thinking. What happens between now and 2030? Because we know, as of this year's UN General Assembly, we're not meeting those targets. We're way behind. What does that actually mean? What does it actually mean for you when you're done with your studies, you go back and work in the water sector? What does that actually mean for planetary health and water? So that's where I end. Thank you very much.
I'm sure we have